Hello and welcome. My name is Tom. This is the Enthusiasm Project Season 9, Episode 6, Not Playing Any Tricks. Today we're going to talk about beginner versus pro gear and that pesky law of diminishing returns. I think this is an interesting topic, both in terms of practicality and in terms of sort of like a psychological side of things that I know I have felt ways about beginner gear and pro gear. And as you move through your journey of learning something, some kind of audio video production and starting out and going somewhere, it can kind of be a difficult road to navigate. And I think it's worth talking about and sort of diving into a bit because it does kind of form the foundation of whether or not you're setting yourself up for success in a practical way a lot of the time. So that's the topic today. But before we jump into that, I definitely owe a huge thank you to everyone who sent in questions for last week's Q&A episode. And I also owe an apology because there is a message that I have forgotten for 2 weeks now. It was sent in way before the Q&A episode, way before the episode before I could have included it. And I don't know why it just sort of sat in the inbox and I didn't see it. So this is a message from Arno that's all about the Zoom F2 and 32-bit float audio. I apologize for not including this sooner, not including it in the Q&A episode, but hey, now we get our own little separate discussion right here at the top of this episode. So before we dive into the discussion on beginner versus pro gear, let's hear a little bit about Zoom F2 32-bit float audio from Arno.
Hey Tom, this is Arno, all the way from the Netherlands. Well, all the way, not really. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know that I'm a big fan of your podcast. And the moment when you release it, I think it's like from Sunday to Monday night, basically, which is perfect for us because that's Monday morning, and I always listen to podcasts in the car. So to grab back to an older topic you discussed, no need for video. Basically, it's annoying because I'm in the car and then I'm like, well, I want to see it, but yeah, well, maybe not. Anyway, I saw your video about the Zoom F2 and about the 32-bit float audio. And I noticed that Rode got that as well now on their latest firmware update for the Wireless Go 2. So that might be an interesting one as well to use with all the internal recording and whatnot. So yeah, I'm gonna order the Go 2 and see what that's gonna be like. By the way, I'm using the NT-USB. It's my travel mic. Yeah, just wanted to let you know that.
Alrighty, thank you, Arno, for that message. I appreciate it. There's a few things that I want to point out on there. First, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it. I'm really glad the timing of the podcast works out. It's been Mondays since kind of forever, I guess. It's midnight my time is when it's released. I'm on Pacific time, so I know it's a little different everywhere, but I'm glad it's working out for you. I just figured a lot of people have podcasts they listen to throughout the week. A lot of podcasts are weekly, and if I could just have mine available at the start of the work week, then people who want to listen to it could kind of just find it. It could fit it into their schedule at any point throughout the week, and then there'd be a new episode the next one. So I'm glad that works out really, really well. The other thing, we'll talk about the 32-bit float, but I like that you mentioned going back to video podcasts and not being something you need because you listen more than watch. I do want to bring up the whole thing with YouTube and YouTube incorporating podcasts and what that means. And I've been trying very hard to digest all that information and figure it out so that I want to do an episode about it where we can explain it. I also want to do a couple updates to my podcasting course so that way, it seems like something that's worth touching on. It seems a little confusing now, but overall, I think it's going to be a really cool thing. And I'm going to touch on that probably in next week's episode, if not the week after that. We're going to sort of take another look at video podcasting and specifically YouTube coming into the world of podcasting, because that's kind of important if you're deciding if you want video or audio. But what's really exciting to me about this update, potentially, from what it sounds like, is you won't need a video version to be listed in YouTube's podcast directory, which would be huge because for people who have audio only shows, especially shows that have been on for a long time, and you have, years of audio only episodes, all that whole back catalog can now, you can basically use YouTube like another podcast directory, like Apple or Spotify or Google. That would be amazing. So I'm glad the lack of video isn't hurting you here. I would still love to find a way to have an easy video workflow. I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe these YouTube updates will kind of give me some idea. But I really enjoy the audio only production, and it would be amazing if that could be included in YouTube, because YouTube is such an amazing platform for discovery and just, for creating and listening on. So excited about that. But when I talk about 32-bit float, it's funny, I didn't really look at the little audio recorders. Because I had the original Rode Wireless Go. I mean, I still have it and I love it. And I also have the Deity Pocket Wireless, both of which I like, but they don't do like their own recording. The transmitters don't record. They don't have 32-bit float or anything like that. They're kind of just the original of those wireless compact things. So I kind of didn't pay attention to like the Rode Wireless Go 2 and other things that came out when they started incorporating onboard recording and 32-bit float. And I know the DJI mic does all that as well. So I guess the strength, though, to the F2 over those is that it is less expensive. So if you're not looking for the wireless thing, you're just looking for the audio recording side of things, it is less expensive. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, this might not apply to the DJI mic or some of the other ones where like they come in a charging case. So as long as the case is charged, every time you take the mic out, it's fully charged. But for some of the other ones like the Rode and the Deity that I have, I am charging, the things separately, which can sometimes be a little bit annoying, but it's not the end of the world. However, the F2 just takes AAA batteries, and alkaline batteries are something that I thought was like, when am I ever going to need these again? Like years ago, get rid of them, never need them again. And then when I started learning to fly and working on my pilot's license, a lot of the things that I needed to buy for that take alkaline batteries, like my headset, which is it's like a top of the line aviation headset, runs on AA batteries. My backup radio runs on AA batteries. And I'm kind of confused about this. And then I realized, and the reason it explains it in a lot of the manuals is because those batteries don't lose their charge over time. Obviously, bad things happen if you leave a battery in a device for like 2 years and then it explodes or something. But, in something like a backup radio or a headset, if it sits in a bag for a couple of weeks and doesn't get used and then you turn it on, it doesn't decharge. It's exactly the same as where you left it in terms of battery power. And so it's kind of cool that the F2 has AAAs. You could get rechargeable ones, but it's sort of a neat thing where I never worry about it really being out of battery, because I know if I don't use it, since I don't use it every day, it's kind of a cool thing. So anyway, the other thing that's really exciting is I didn't realize the Rode got 32-bit float via a firmware update, which is awesome. And it makes those an amazing value. But what that also makes me really interested in is, hey, if you can add 32-bit float audio to devices via firmware, what about that old Rodecaster Pro, the top of the line recorder? Maybe that could possibly get a 32-bit float firmware update. That'd be pretty amazing. So thanks again, Arno, for the message, and apologies for the late reply. I would hope to be more professional in the future about replying on time. And speaking of professional, let's talk about beginner versus pro gear. That's a transition for you. So the reason I wanted to talk about this was I was listening to an episode last week. I talked about the 16 Stops podcast with Josh Satin and Brandon Talbert. Wait. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking. Brandon, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I think I just Talbot. Brandon, yeah. If you're listening to this, I'm really sorry. I don't have it up in front of me and my mind is completely blanking. But we talk all the time, and I know you. Yes? Okay. So, boy, if I didn't want this to be uncomfortable, I could edit it out. But anyway, Brandon was talking specifically about starting his camera journey using the Canon M50, which is a very small, compact camera. And at one point, he had talked his way into some sort of like pro media pass kind of setup at an event. And so it was all these pro photographers with their huge cameras and big lenses. And he was there with like the tiny little M50 and felt a little bit ridiculous. And listening to that, I remembered how I felt sometimes when I got like my very first DSLR was the Canon it was the Canon XTI. Didn't even do video, wasn't the T series at all. And I remember getting that and thinking, oh my God, this is a real camera. I was so excited to have it. It had interchangeable lenses, the whole deal. And after that, I remember then going places and sometimes, especially doing sports, I was doing like a lot of high school sports stuff at the time. And so I would be there taking photos, and there would sometimes be like people from the local newspaper with like a Canon 1D or something, some giant camera with a huge lens. And I did sort of feel like, I don't want to call almost like a poser. I hate to say it, but using what I was using next to them, I did feel kind of silly, and I didn't like that feeling. And obviously I learned pretty quickly that was just all in my head, and nobody else really ever made me feel that way. And most people who don't know anything about cameras anyway, they don't know the difference between a Canon Rebel and a Canon 1D. It's all just big cameras. That's kind of what they talk about. So there's sort of that like psychological, emotional side of feeling ashamed of beginner gear. And so I was thinking about that and thinking of my own experience. And then I was thinking, but there are times when there's a massive difference between beginner and professional gear, and that can be very difficult to navigate when you're starting out. So for example, in the world of microphones, and speaking of microphones, I am using the Lewitt LCT 440 again this week, just because I wanted a little more time with this microphone, and I really like the way that it sounds. And my 5th generation NT1 isn't here yet. So I'm on the 440, and I'm running it into the Rodecaster Pro II on the NT1 preset. So I think that works pretty well. But microphones, for example, I think that's a good place to start when talking about professional versus beginner gear. Because you can go to a website like Amazon, you can look up XLR microphones, sort by price, lowest to highest, and you might find those $15, $20 microphones. You grab a $20 newer microphone, and you're like, hey, here's an XLR microphone, it's great. But then using something else like the 440 that I'm using, or I don't know, something like an Earthworks or the SM7B, there's a huge difference between those things. It's not just the name brand. Like everything from the build quality and the durability to, of course, most importantly, the sound quality and the way that the microphone actually performs and functions, they're almost like not even the same thing. It's just so different in terms of the quality that you're going to get. So there is that huge difference between gear, but it's not really black and white. And I think there's kind of a spectrum, because say, you spend $20 on some cheap microphone, or you spend $400 on the SM7B. Okay, but what about everything in between? It should be no surprise that $400 microphone is going to be better than the $20 one. But what about a $60 one, an $80 one, $150? Like, at what point does that return? What is it? The law of diminishing returns kick in and start happening? Because if you go from that $20 microphone to a $100 microphone, so instead of getting the super cheap one, you get something like a pod mic, you get an SM58, any other number of $100 microphones out there that are escaping my mind right now. Even something less than 100, like the Samson Q2U, for example, you're going to have a huge, huge jump in quality and usability and features and everything. But then going from that $100 mic, like take something like the SM58 from Shure, and then you jump up to a $200 microphone, a $300 microphone. So you go from the SM58 to maybe the MV7 from Shure, or, even the microphone I'm using right now. I think there's going to be a lot less of a difference. And then I even did a video not that long ago where I compared my $1,200 Sennheiser MKH50, my shotgun microphone, against a $2,500 Schoeps CMIT 5U, another condenser shotgun microphone. And even though the Schoeps cost twice as much as the Sennheiser, and the Sennheiser's already an expensive microphone, the difference between them was really small. The Schoeps was better. The more expensive one was better, but definitely not better enough for me to consider, buying it or replacing the Sennheiser with it. And it was kind of crazy. Like, it was to the point, it's almost like when people are like professional cyclists and they start worrying about how much their bike computer weighs and they need to shave their legs to like increase aerodynamicness. If you're at that level, those little things make a difference. But for most of us, whether I have shaved legs or a heavy bike computer, those are not the limiting factors on my cycling performance, I promise you, at all. So, by the time you're noticing the difference between the Sennheiser MKH50 and the CMIT 5U, the $1,200 versus $2,500 microphone, you're probably in a really, really specific situation and a really specific setting where those differences, where you can even understand those differences and feel like you need them. So that's where it's like, at a certain point, you start spending a little bit of money, then you invest a little bit more, and you get a huge return on that investment because the quality just goes up so much, going from that $20 microphone to the $100 microphone. And then you keep spending money, but even going from 200 to or 100 to 200, you're increasing. Wait, no, math is hard. If you go from 20 to 100, that's $80. So if you go from 100 to 180, let's keep it another $80. You're not going to get that same leap in quality as you did before. And if you go from 180 to 260, 320, $400, if you keep going up, you're not going to have that huge return on that investment. And so that's where that law of diminishing returns comes into play. And that applies to everything I found in audio video production. It's, the low end stuff can be really affordable. As soon as you invest a little bit more to get something decent, it's a huge difference in what you're able to do and the overall quality. And then when you make the leap to higher end things, it becomes a little less noticeable and a lot more specific. It can still be hugely important. So I'm not saying like you should never go for the super high end thing, but it's a very big difference. The difference between, we'll say something like the Sony A6400. I'm trying to think of what one of their like least expensive crop sensor cameras is. Maybe even the ZV-E10 versus the A7 IV. Pretty huge difference between those cameras. Difference between the A7 IV and A7S III or FX3, much, much smaller, even though, there are differences and stuff. So that's a tough thing to navigate when you're just starting out, because most of us probably do have some kind of budget. If you just have unlimited funding, then it doesn't matter. Like, just buy the best of everything, who cares? But most of us don't have that. And so you want to probably spend the least amount of money, but not waste your money. And that can be a really tough thing to it can be a really tough thing to figure out when the level of gear is actually going to make a difference. Because also I think a lot of us, when we're starting out with something new, we think we don't need the best. Like, I'm new at this, I don't need the very best, I just need to get by. And that might be true sometimes, but sometimes that can hurt you. So for example, let's talk about cameras. You want to start taking photos, maybe doing some video. So you want to get a camera, you want to get a good camera, probably means something with an interchangeable lens. It might make sense on the surface to just get the cheapest thing you can find and then see how it works, see how you like it, see if you want to stick with it, and then down the line you can always upgrade. However, it could also be not the smartest thing to do that, because the gear itself could potentially discourage you, and or you could outgrow it so fast that you want to upgrade quickly. And now by the time you've bought a beginner camera and then like a beginner to intermediate level camera to upgrade, you spend as much money as just jumping into like a nice solid intermediate or even higher level camera. And you could have just done that from the beginning, but how would you know? And another good analogy there for anybody who plays guitar, I think this is one that fits me at least. I think this applies to a lot of hobbies. But as someone who started playing guitar in high school, I had no money. So to get a guitar was the cheapest thing I could get. My very first guitar, I've talked about this. It's a Squier Bullet, 2001 Squier Bullet. It cost $90 at Guitar Center when I bought it. And it's fine. It's a totally fine guitar. It works. I had broken it for 20 years, but it works again now. And it's completely fine. And I think anybody, I think now, having played guitar as long as I have, I could take pretty much anything and make it sound okay. Not necessarily that my playing's the best in the world, of course, but I could make the guitar sound okay. I could figure out, how I need to adjust my technique to adapt the guitar to make it sound its best through whatever amp I'm using, based on whatever strings it has on, whatever pickups it has. I can adapt to it and make it sound pretty good. But it doesn't mean I'm going to enjoy it. Whereas if I grab something that's much more high end, it's going to just feel like, as cliche as it sounds, it starts to feel more like an extension of your body. It feels so natural. It feels so comfortable. It's much easier to make sound good. And so it's going to be more fun for me to play. But as somebody who's just starting out, I'd be so interested to know, when it comes to something like a $90 guitar or the absolute cheapest camera that a company makes, how many people buy those things and then are still using them 6 months later or a year later. And I don't even mean using those, but are even doing that thing. Like, it's one thing to buy a camera outgrow it quickly, upgrade to a new one. But how many people buy, the cheapest Canon Rebel and use it for a little while because they want to get into cameras, and then they just sort of put it on a shelf and forget about it, and they don't use the camera anymore? How many people buy a $90 guitar, learn a couple songs on it, and then it just sort of sits on a guitar stand in the corner of the room collecting dust after that and never gets played? I think it's probably kind of a lot. Whereas if you invest a little bit more and get something that's a little bit better, the quality of the thing actually does encourage you to play more. Even getting my hockey skates recently, I can't remember if I told this on a podcast episode or not, but when I was getting fitted for, I was learning to ice skate, or I've been learning to ice skate, and I was using rental skates, and everybody was just telling me the rental skates aren't doing you any favors. And I thought that, my skill level's not at a point where the skates are holding me back. So I decided to go get my own skates. And I was like, I'll spend $150 on a pair of skates and that'll be good. Turns out, nope, you're probably not going to spend only $150 on a pair of ice skates. Much like anything else, the sky's kind of the limit. But I was a little bit overwhelmed and I didn't know where to begin. And so the salesperson at the store, which was great, like it's literally only a hockey shop, so they know what they're talking about. They're not working on commission, so they really don't care what what you buy. They weren't putting any pressure on me. But I was trying to figure out, like, I want something that's good and comfortable. I don't want to spend a ton of money, but I don't want to be discouraged by it. And then somehow it had come up that the person I was talking to played guitar. And I said to him, what I really want is like a Mexican Fender. I don't want the super cheap Squier. I want the Mexican Fender. I don't need an American series. And he was like, gotcha. That's this one right here. And he showed me exactly the skate that I needed that would have been like the ice skating equivalent to a Mexican Fender. Because with guitars, you have Squier, which is owned by Fender, and they've gotten like really good in recent years. So the low end ones still going to be pretty low end. The middle-ish ones, like if you're spending $200 to $300 on a guitar, you're probably getting something that's actually pretty encouraging. But then if you jump up to an official Fender guitar, the cheapest Fenders are made in Mexico. That's actually how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I have 4 Mexican Fenders and 1 American Fender. And they're all great. Like the Mexican ones are awesome. And there is a step up. It might be blurring the line between a high-end Squier and a low-end Mexican Fender. It might be hard to tell the difference a little bit. But in general, when you're getting a Mexican Fender, you're not getting the fanciest, ultra highest quality guitar that they make, but you're getting something that's going to be, I'm staring at one right now that's 22, 21 years old and works and plays the same as when I took it out of the box 21 years ago. So you're getting that level of quality, and it's fun and it's encouraging. And the difference between that Mexican Fender and an American one it's the difference between the Sennheiser MKH50 and the Schoeps CMIT 5U. It's there, but it's much more subtle than going from the Squier to the Mexican Fender. And so that was a really, the point there was that I wanted something that I was going to be able to learn on without totally breaking the bank, but I didn't want to outgrow it very quickly. And I also, didn't want to be discouraged because, as soon as I stepped on the ice wearing my own skates for the first time, it was like, oh, this doesn't even feel like I'm doing the same thing, even though in my mind, what's the difference between the rental skates and the personal skates? So the gear really can make a huge difference. And as time has gone on, something that I've learned, which is, it's a total cliche, but it just becomes truer and truer, is the old adage of cry once, buy once. And the more you try to save money, sometimes the more money you just end up spending, because then you end up trying to deal with workarounds. You end up trying to deal with limitations, frustrations, or needing to upgrade really quickly. The number of people I've known who've just gotten the cheapest camera, cheapest microphone out there, and then immediately wanted something better. And now, like, ultimately, they've spent $1,500 to end up using a $1,000 camera is kind of, something that happens there. And there's also the whole thing of, lifespan and durability. The world of microphones, those $20 microphones I have, even the ones that work fine, they're not nearly as durable, honestly, as, the $100 Shure or the $100 Rode is. It's a different thing. Like, there's a reason you can get a 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old high-quality microphone and have it still work completely fine. Whereas I've literally had some of those cheap mics that I've gotten for videos. if they just sit for 6 months, they stop working because stuff starts failing and things start falling apart and coming disconnected on them. So, there is definitely a thing of higher end gear being more reliable, having a longer lifespan. And, that kind of stuff is important to keep in mind too. So that's why when people always ask like for a cheap camera recommendation, and I lean towards the Sony ZV-E10, which is still like $800, maybe even more than $800 if you get the one with the lens. And like, oh, that's not cheap. I want like $300 or $400. I'm like, don't buy the $300 or $400 camera. If you're listening to this and you have the $300 or $400 camera, you can still do great things with it, but it's not going to be as easy, especially if you're just starting out and you don't necessarily have all the tips and tricks and techniques and experience to work around those limitations. Those limitations can be those hurdles that might be easier for someone else to jump over, could be huge blockages for you. And I tried a couple years ago, when I was still working at the school, I rented out a Canon T3. I think that was the like lowest end camera we had at the time. It wasn't the T3i, it was just the T3. And I had my EOS R at the time. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to make a video that compares the Canon T3 to the EOS R, and see what the quality is like. And my whole point in making the video was to do the thing of, you can make something that looks great with this. So I filmed a whole bunch of stuff using the T3 and working around its limitations. And that video, it's fine. Like the footage from the T3 looks great. It's a very capable camera. You can do a ton of stuff with it. It's much nicer than most things I had in my whole life growing up. But oh my God, was it so much harder to use than the EOS R. Everything from just getting a good image, getting focus to work, the whole process was so much more frustrating, and I enjoyed myself so much less while I was working on it versus, at the time I was using my EOS R, which is a great camera and I loved it. I had fun using that camera and it made things super easy and it was reliable. It was a hugely different experience. So even though, yes, it was possible to get great results with that low end thing, if that had been the only camera I'd ever used, no wonder people would give up, because this is not fun at all. Like it's just not fun. So that's where it's like, whenever you're looking to get into something, it's this thing you have to play with yourself. No, you don't have to do that. It's this game you have to play with yourself. Yikes. Where you have to sort of look at what your goal is, what your budget is, and really get the best thing possible. And especially with the way prices are going up, it probably means going out of your comfort zone a little bit. Like my story of walking into the ice skating shop thinking I'm going to spend $150, and my skates that I got were $450. And the downside to that too is literally if I got the same skates half a size smaller, they would have been $350, because like intermediate sizing goes from like, size 3 to 6.5, and then senior sizing goes from 7 and up. And for some reason, the jump from intermediate to senior is $100 price jump. But especially with something like ice skates, you can't have ill-fitting ones. So it's not worth getting the smaller one just to save some money, because every time I skate, I would just be in hideous pain. So I needed the right size, even though it was $100 more. But I'm really glad that I did that. And it's been encouraging to keep doing that and to keep skating and to put myself in a position where I'm the bottleneck in the workflow. Like I think that's ultimately the thing. I remember talking about that on a recent episode, but it's you want to be the bottleneck, right? Like you don't want to have your gear be the thing that's getting in the way. You want your gear to be capable, and all that's left is for you to build your skills and your experience and your knowledge to make things even better. And having the right gear that does that is hugely, hugely important. The other side of this, there's more that I want to talk about when it comes to the specific gear, but there's another component that I want to touch on before we get to that, which is the psychological side of things. Kind of going back to the story about feeling embarrassed about your gear. I think that can sometimes push people to make the wrong decisions with gear as well. I have gotten a lot of messages over the years from people who want to, they need help buying something, a camera, a Rodecaster, whatever it might be. And, people ask a question, or even sometimes people buy something, they're just excited and they send me a picture like, look what I got. And it's, the box with the Rodecaster in it or something, which is awesome. And I'm always super excited for them. But I've had a number of people over the years also send me photos like, here's a thing I bought. Cool, that's awesome. And then like a week or two later, look what else I got. And it's, it's a camera and it's a lens and here's another thing, which I'm excited about. But then what sometimes I end up seeing is people have sent me pictures where it's like, it almost looks like a store display of just boxes of gear that are all unopened. And the person didn't necessarily have a specific need for it. They just kind of wanted it. They sort of maybe looked at what I was using and wanted to they like what I'm doing. They want to do a version of that. So they grab all the same gear and now it's all sitting there, but they don't necessarily know why they have it all. And so it doesn't get used and it becomes overwhelming and it's so much to learn all at once. And that is not something I would recommend doing, is just like, I want you to get the best gear you possibly can, but just kind of going overboard is probably not a great place to start. The advice I always give is like, start with what you have and upgrade as your needs become apparent, because you will find friction and sore points in your workflow, and then you can upgrade your gear around that. But sometimes people want to upgrade their gear because it becomes more of an ego thing. Like, they don't want to be seen with the beginner camera. They don't want someone to think they're a beginner. They want to use the super pro thing, even if they really don't need it. And yeah, so the idea of being ashamed of your gear is a very real thing. I think I oversimplified it, I think. The reason that I made a video last year that was called, "Is the Blue Yeti Really That Bad?" was because there's a lot of discussion about the Blue Yeti microphone. It's a USB microphone. Lots of people hate it. And the reason that people hate it, as I kind of go over in that video, is because it sort of was ultra ubiquitous for a long time. The blue was blue ubiquitous because it was one of the original USB microphones that was easily accessible back in like 2009. Tons of people got one. It was kind of one of the only options, really. And especially maybe from like 2013 to 2018, it was like the only mic that you saw. So if someone had a podcast or YouTube channel or was doing streaming, it was just like all Blue Yetis everywhere. And obviously, like, as soon as something becomes that popular, there's naturally a backlash against it. But also because it was something that so many people are using without any other knowledge or experience in some cases, a lot of people are using it wrong. And when you use a microphone wrong, it often sounds very bad. And so then people were like, this microphone sucks. And as time went on, way better options came out there. Like the Blue Yeti, I think, is still a very totally usable, very decent microphone. That's kind of my ending conclusion in that video, is the Blue Yeti's fine. It sounds great. It's really more about your technique and how you're using it. But there are better, more modern options out there now than there were when it was released, 14 years ago. So ultimately, what that meant, though, is because of the hate that the Blue Yeti gets, and since I made that video, I've gotten a lot of comments and messages and emails from people who they liked the video because they said it made them feel better about their Yeti. And they had felt bad because they got it and they had gotten embarrassed. Like, people are telling me that they're in like Discord communities and their friends are ripping on them for using a Yeti, or they want to like position it out of the frame on camera because they don't want people to see that they're using a Yeti, but it's the only microphone that they have. And positioning out of frame doesn't sound as good as when it's close to you. And to me, that's like a really sad, disappointing thing. It's also why I don't like to speak badly about gear, even if I don't particularly like a certain type of gear, like the Canon T3, for example, right now. I guess the T3i, I think, might be something like that, is like the lowest end Canon DSLR that you can get currently. Even though that's not a camera I would recommend or that I would purchase myself, I don't want to say bad things about it because plenty of people have them and are excited about them and want to use them. And the last thing I would want to do is make somebody feel bad for their equipment. And so there's sort of that line to walk between having your own preferences and opinions and being judgmental or making people feel judged, which is very much, very, very much a real thing that happens. And I guess the way I've always looked at it personally is I'm super into what other people are using, but I've never, ever felt judgmental. If someone uses a Yeti, if someone's filming with just a webcam or whatever, I'm interested in what people choose to use, just because I find that fascinating. Like, why are you using this microphone? Why are you using that camera? I don't care what it is. I don't even necessarily care what the end results are. I just care about like this person needed a camera, they needed a microphone or whatever piece of gear, and this is what they're using, what they chose. I'm wondering why. And then I also kind of go back in my own mind and imagine, okay, you got this microphone. At one point, there was a day that you got this microphone and you were excited about it. And I'm sure it brought a smile to your face. And, you know, you tested it out for the first time and all this cool stuff happened. And maybe that's forgotten now. It's kind of like if you see any car on the road, but especially sometimes like older cars, and you imagine like, wow, one day that was like the shiny brand new car sitting at a car dealership. Somebody had to take it for a test drive at some point. Somebody had to spend hours filling out paperwork for it. And somebody drove it off the lot, probably pretty excited that they had bought a new car. They showed friends, they showed family, like people got in it, like, want to check out the new car for the first time. And now, you know, maybe it's not as new and impressive, or maybe it's not the fanciest, but it's like that thing has a story behind it where it did solve problems and bring a lot of joy to somebody. And I feel the same is true with a lot of gear that people are using, regardless of the level of it. Even honestly, like I probably shouldn't be making fun of the $20 microphones that much. The only reason I do that is because my $20 newer NW800 is the worst microphone I've ever used. I've heard other people use them where they make it sound good. Mine sounds like pure dog turds. It's so bad. And the reason I feel okay making fun of that is because I know that there are other ones out there that sound good, but also because I think that does kind of prove a point. The fact that mine sounds bad, somebody else's sounds good, someone else's sounds in the middle, means that it shows the variation in quality. If you get 10, actually I can vouch for this because at this point in my life, I've personally and professionally ordered at least a dozen SM7Bs, probably more, maybe like 20 SM7Bs. Every single one of those from 2014 up until right 2021 was the last time I took an SM7B out of the box, have all performed exactly the same. There's zero variation between them in terms of quality. There's no difference. You could order 3 NW800s and they're probably all three going to sound and perform a little differently, even though they're the same microphone. And that's one of the things that you get stuck with. And that's also why people have opinions where they're like, oh, I bought this super cheap thing and it's great. And it's like, because they might have gotten a great one, but then you buy a version of that thing and yours is busted and kind of sucks. But that doesn't really go into the ashamed, like judgment part. Ultimately, as someone who has been in that situation, who's been in environments, sometimes along other professional photographers or videographers, where I was using gear that I didn't feel good enough with. I mean, it still happens to this day. Like last summer when I was out filming with Peter when he was visiting, we do the same thing. We use a lot of the same gear. I felt like I was such a just novice, noob, beginner compared to like the level he was working at, which of course he didn't make me feel that way. That was all just me, but it's like I've definitely felt that way many times throughout my life. And what I think is important to remember if you're using any gear, but especially if you find yourself in a situation where you're using beginner gear in an environment where other people are using higher end gear, is first and foremost, most other people just don't care. If people aren't involved in your world at all, they don't notice a difference. It's like me talking about a Squier versus a Mexican Fender versus an American Fender. Most people would just see guitar. And that's all that they're going to think about. Same goes with audio video production gear. Most people are just going to see a microphone, a camera. There's no difference. It's all the same thing. So most people just don't care. Even other people working probably don't care. They're focused on whatever they're doing. They're really not paying attention to what you're doing. There might be people like me who are just interested. They might take note. Oh, that person's using a Canon M50. That person's using, what is that? It's not a Rode. It's some like off-brand video mic. Like they might be noticing what you're using, but it does not come from a place of judgment. It comes from a place of interest and enthusiasm. Like just curious what other people are doing. It hasn't been common for years, especially since phones took over. But as a kid, I loved going to theme parks for many reasons. But one of them was to just scope out the camcorders because like every dad had a shoulder bag with the camcorder in it. And I would love to see like, oh, are they using like the Sony strap that came with their Handycam? Do they carry extra tapes in their bag? Like, oh, they put a wide angle lens attachment on their camcorder. This person's using VHS-C. This person's using 8mm. That person's lugging around a whole VHS camcorder. fascinating. Like, I just loved seeing all the different ways that people were using stuff, and I didn't care what it was. There was no judgment call. It was all just interesting. And I think there are people like that just, oh, you got a camera? What do you have? Oh, that's cool. I don't care what it is. I'm interested in cameras. I like cameras. Let's see what it is. Ultimately, if there is someone who cares what you're using and then makes you feel bad for it, they're not worth listening to. Like, they're just really not. Even if I can't imagine an actual professional. No, I take that back. I post videos on YouTube and I have people sending me their resumes all the time. I can definitely imagine actual professionals ridiculing people with, lesser gear, but that is just coming from a place of that person's own insecurity, that person's own just jerkishness, and it's nothing that you need to, it's like not your problem. Honestly, it's their problem. It's not your problem. Nobody should ever make you feel bad for gear that you choose to use, because ultimately you should just be using whatever works for you. And that's the most important thing. If the thing that works for you is the cheapest, bare bones, like crummiest, quote unquote, version of something, that's awesome. If the thing that works for you, even if you're a beginner, but you just want the super high end thing, and then you think people are going to like look at me weird because I don't know what I'm doing, and I walk in with this super expensive thing, who cares? As long as it works for you, that's absolutely all that matters when it comes to gear, including microphones that you can accidentally smack with your hand right now. So now, those are kind of the two areas of like feeling confused about gear. How do you upgrade? What do you get? Like literally the gear that you get. Are you going to get a beginner thing, an intermediate thing, a professional thing? And then there's a psychological side, feeling embarrassed, feeling, just how you feel about your gear, which is important. Now, let's kind of jump back and sort of talk more about this gear journey, because at some point, even if you get something really decent, like say you decide, okay, I'm not going to get the cheapest camera as my first camera. I'm going to get the Sony ZV-E10. Tom recommended it. He's a super smart guy. I'm going to listen to him. You get your ZV-E10, you use it for a while. It's great. But then you hit a point where you're like, maybe I do want to upgrade. That's totally fine. That's a thing that's probably going to happen. You might decide in that case that you want a full frame sensor. You might want something that, like the FX3 has a fan that prevents any overheating, and you might be in an environment that's super warm, so that fan might be good. You might want certain frame rates that the camera doesn't offer. Any number of reasons you might want to upgrade. But the camera itself, as an entry-level thing, should be good enough to get you to the point where you're excited enough and capable enough that an upgrade matters. Like that you hit a point where you want an upgrade and you understand the upgrade, but the thing you're using isn't just then going to have to sit in a drawer. Like the ZV-E10 in this case is such a good, capable camera that if you got that and then you upgrade it to like an FX3 or something, the ZV-E10 still would have a place in your workflow. It would be an amazing B camera. Maybe you could set it up as a dedicated webcam. It could be a small travel photo camera. Like, it's not something that as soon as you get an upgraded version, you'll never want to touch that camera again. Like, I think that's a good test for a piece of gear where you jump into something, so your first version of something is good enough that even when you upgrade, it doesn't become totally obsolete, assuming you don't like sell it to fund the upgrade or something. But then that begs the question of, do you need the latest and greatest gear? Like, I can't believe that cameras like the A7S III and the FX3 have already been out for almost 3 years. They came out in late 2020. It's early 2023. So, okay, 2.5 years. But, time flies. The A7S III was announced in the summer of 2020. To me, it still feels like a new camera, firmware updates aside. And it wouldn't, I don't think Sony would announce like an A7S IV this year, but I also wouldn't be super surprised. Like if they did say this summer announce that, I wouldn't be like, that would make sense, I guess. No, I would think that makes sense. Grammar's hard too. And obviously, especially in the world of YouTube, the need to have the latest and greatest. Just look at Apple stuff. Look at every time Apple comes out with a new computer, how many people are like, well, I'm upgrading now. It's like you had a perfectly fine M1 Max MacBook Pro, and now you have an M2 Max MacBook Pro, and your workflow is no different. Like, do you really need the latest and greatest? Probably not most of the time. Most people don't. So from a purely practical standpoint, if you buy the stuff that works for you, you probably don't need to upgrade just because something new came out. I was thinking this morning, if I didn't have my channel, would I have gotten the Rodecaster Pro II? Because I have my channel and I make videos about the Rodecaster, I knew when the Rodecaster Pro II was coming out that I definitely was going to be getting one. And I was setting money aside when I was thinking like, oh, it's going to happen. And then Rode approached me and they ended up sending me one, which was amazing. So that's great and super exciting. So I was trying to think though, would I have upgraded it otherwise? And I think that if I were not making content about it, if Rode wasn't sending me the second one, I still would have upgraded to the Rodecaster Pro II just for the better preamps and headphone amps. I think for me, that would have been enough to warrant the upgrade. But there are also other things, like this morning I was reading a rumor about Apple's going to release new iMacs. I really like the current iMacs. I've had a couple iMacs over the course of my life and I love them. And my computer labs that I taught in were all iMacs. It's such a great form factor, design, like practical use of a computer. I love the iMac. And now they have all those colors. They have a blue one. It's pretty amazing. Every time I see a blue one somewhere, I'm like, that is the coolest computer ever. And so I was kind of thinking like, well, if Apple's going to come out with a new iMac soon, then it might be worth, maybe I could get an iMac for my office and have that there. There's zero need for that though. Honestly, my base model M1 Mac Mini, which is, what I will be importing this file into and uploading, so it does all my podcasting and streaming and stuff, it still works like a champ. There's a zero need for me to upgrade. So that was kind of the ultimate thing, was like, no, I don't need to upgrade. I still see so many people when they sit down to do presentations, like working creative professionals whip out MacBook Pros that have the glowing Apple logo on the back of them, which means it's a pre-Touch Bar, pre-2016 MacBook Pro, because the last time that Apple made those was 2015. Well, I guess they produced them into 2016, but that means if you see someone with a MacBook that has the glowing Apple logo on the back, that computer is at newest 8 years old. And for a lot of people, still working perfectly fine. There's no need most of the time to have the latest and greatest. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes people upgrade and then, 2 months later, a new version of their thing came out and they're like, oh my God, I should have gotten the new thing. And it's like, should you though? Would that be making all the difference in the world? If you buy something and a week later a huge update comes out, it usually does make sense just to, exchange most companies even have like return policies that would let you exchange it. But beyond something like that, there's probably not really a reason to have the latest and greatest of stuff. Now, some people love it. Like when it comes to computers, I've had friends and I know people, and obviously there's people all over YouTube who are just hobbyists and they're enthusiasts and they're into this stuff and they just want to try the latest and greatest. So it's not about whether or not they need it. They're just curious about it and they're excited about it. So they get the new version of a computer every time. That totally makes sense. And that's bringing them joy and they're having fun with it. And if that's you, that's also totally fine as well. I know there's some people, especially in the world of computers, I guess it's more of a financial thing. Like I will buy a computer and then as soon as a new one is announced, I will sell this one for the maximum amount of money possible, put that money towards the new one. So you kind of always have the most recent thing, but every time you upgrade, you're only spending a couple $100s. I'm someone who likes to have stuff and use it as long as I possibly can. So it's not necessarily me, but there are nuances and shades of personal preference. But generally speaking, you probably don't need the latest and greatest. And when it comes to that, speaking of beginner versus pro gear, I think it's really important to look at how professionals work and professional organizations work when it comes to the latest and greatest, because very few of them have it. If you go to studios, if you go to production companies, very few of them are using whatever the brand new thing is that came out for many, many different reasons. A lot of pros and a lot of organizations use older gear. Some of that is just, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Like if everything is working, I know that's how I feel. My workflow is great. Why would I want to throw some weird new camera, some weird codec, some format into the mix when everything I'm doing is suiting my needs just perfectly? I kind of wouldn't, unless I'm just curious about something, like I checked out the Nikon camera a couple of months ago. That was amazing. I loved that camera. I would definitely feel like if you spend your money on that camera, the Z9, you're getting what you pay for. But for me to incorporate a Z9 and then have to get new lenses and like, it would be such a mess in my workflow versus just sticking with what I have, even though the thing itself is actually great. And I think a lot of pros and a lot of professional organizations work that same way. Speaking specifically, like the one that comes to mind for me personally is when I worked at the local TV station for a number of years. They did not have the latest and greatest because the stuff is really expensive. And so they spend, at that time, each camera was like $20,000 to $40,000, I think, just for the camera setup. They don't want to replace that every year or two. Those need to last a long time. Plus, everything needs to be, everyone's kind of trained on the equipment in organizations like that. So you don't want let's learn the nuances of this slightly different camera body. No, we all just want to know how this thing works. You invested a lot of money in it. It's getting the job done. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think that's a big part of it. And a lot of these organizations, sometimes to their detriment, become heavily invested in stuff. I'm thinking of Avid for editing, which is, if we talked about this in the video editing podcast last season, but if you're looking at editing software, we hear a lot about Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, but one of the, if not the most commonly used editing application for movies and TV shows is Avid. I don't think it's because Avid is the best. It is strong in a couple of specific areas, and we talked about that in this episode. It's great for collaboration. It's great for having multiple people work on a project, doing iterations of versions of timelines and things. But I don't think it's also a huge pain to use and wildly inefficient and the least intuitive application ever. However, a lot of studios and production houses and things, and they invested so much money because, especially with Avid, it's not just installing an application onto a computer. You kind of need an entire special beast of a computer rig to even run it. And so by the time you get that set up, where you can have a whole editing department, and that you're working collaboratively with other studios and other editing, offices, that's a lot of infrastructure you've put in place, and you're not going to jump ship to something else that quickly or that willingly because it's going to be so much pain, even if the other thing is technically better on paper. So that's also something is a lot, and in that case, I think it's a bad thing. I think companies overinvested in something. Now they're sort of stuck with what may not be the best thing to be using. But sometimes it's not a bad thing, and it's just you've invested a lot in what you're using. There's no need to update. And I think it can be funny when you talk to professional videographers, audio people, whatever, in the film, TV, video industries, and you kind of realize that they maybe aren't even aware of what the newest gear is. They don't even know when the new camera came out or what new lens came out. They sort of just have what they have. If they need something new, then they just get whatever they need. If they need a 50 millimeter lens, then they go look up, okay, 50 millimeter lens for my lens mount. What are my options? What's in my budget? Okay, I'll get that one. And that's kind of it. That's the thought that goes into it. It's sort of the rest of us that are obsessing over everything. And of course, there are pros who are also nerds about all this stuff and want to know all the differences and things. But, I think that's kind of a funny thing. The number of pro people, especially growing up, I thought, you do this professionally, you must know everything. You're the person I could ask about anything and everything. And the amount of cluelessness, was kind of shocking at first, where it's no, they're pros with what they do. And that's the fact that they spend more time mastering their tools and mastering their equipment and using it to support what they need to do, I think helps them to become even more professional rather than chasing the latest and greatest. So it's hard to talk about beginner versus pro gear without talking about upgrading, when and if you should upgrade and that kind of thing. But sometimes you do decide you want to upgrade, or sometimes you're even just jumping in and you want to, you might know, even though I'm new at this, I know I'm going to stick with it. I don't mind investing a decent chunk of money because this is very important to me. And sometimes that can feel weird to say, like, yeah, I want to start making videos. I will buy a Sony FX6. Like, it might seem a little extravagant or a little over the top. But as long as I think you can do that financially responsibly, I don't think it matters, and you should get whatever's going to help you do what you want to do and have fun doing it and enjoy doing it. And I think that there is something that's that's kind of a dangerous thought, which is a lot of people feel that their gear has to earn its keep. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I know there's a smart way to justify that, and I've done that myself too. I want to buy a new camera or a new lens, and I think like, well, I'll be able to use this. I mean, heck, I'm trying to think of a very specific example, but let's talk about the original Rodecaster. I didn't really buy that intending it to be like a huge part of my channel, but I bought it. I made a video about it. That video has easily paid for the Rodecaster just through ad revenue from that video. You might want to buy a drone, and now you can offer drone services to your clients. So as soon as you get one client who pays you for your drone services, now they've covered the cost of your drone. So there's that way of looking at things, which is savvy and smart. But I think sometimes it gets taken too far where people feel like they can only justify something if it earns them money. And it seems to me like this is most prevalent in like media creation, media production spheres, because going back to like cycling and stuff, bikes can be really expensive. Like a very lightweight bike frame with like good hardware and equipment, that can be, $5,000 to $10,000 or more. Not my bike personally, but people's bikes can do that. And, maybe someone is competing at a semi-pro or professional level and they need that level of gear. But there's a lot of people who just go out for their Saturday morning bike rides that have $8,000 bikes. Those bikes are not earning them any money. And people don't seem to really feel bad about that. Someone wants to buy a $3,000 or a $6,000 custom shop guitar, but they're not a professional musician. They just want to sit in their bedroom, play music on it. That seems to be okay. But when it comes to spending, money on, I guess because audio video production gear can so easily be used to generate revenue and to make money, people feel like it must in order to be worth it. But I think that can also be kind of a dangerous way to look at things, because it can prevent you from enjoying stuff. It can prevent you from giving yourself permission to explore more things. And it can ultimately be something that limits you. Your gear does not have to, the same way that you don't have to deserve it, like you don't have to reach a certain level before you're allowed to buy something. Your gear doesn't have to like generate money in order for it to be a good purchase or for it not to be a waste. As an adult, you should be making financially responsible decisions. But as long as you're doing that, I think everything else is pretty great. And then it's all just about having fun along the way. And the toughest part about any of these discussions about like going from beginner to pro is so much of it is so personal. It depends on skill level. It depends on budget. It depends on the goal of where you want to go, what kind of work you do, the specific things that matter to you. And that's different for everybody. That combination is so different. So one set of equipment, one recommendation, one upgrade path that applies to one person just might not apply to another. It's great to look at what other people are doing, but ultimately, like, it's very hard to just listen to your gut and trust your own instinct. And I guess the whole point here is to tell you that it's an okay thing to do. And just because you don't see other people doing things exactly the way you want to do them or exactly the way you're thinking of doing them doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. As long as you're being responsible, you're getting stuff that lets you do what you want to do, and hopefully you're having a ton of fun along the way, and whatever you have is encouraging you to keep going, then I think you've made the right decision. So that's our discussion on beginner versus pro gear. I'd love to know your thoughts if you want to share them. So as always, feel free to send an email to tom@enthusiasmproject.com. That can be just a typed out email. You can attach a video or voice. I promise I will not wait 2 weeks and multiple episodes to play it. Or as always, you can go to himynameistom.com and then scroll down a little bit on the homepage and just find the little link where you can just, using whatever device you're on, the built-in microphone, you can just submit a message right there super quickly, super easily. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this or on anything else. If you just have a question that you just want to discuss, let's talk about it. I think it might be next week. I'm not 100% sure, but soon we'll definitely be talking about the YouTube podcasting thing. So if you have thoughts, questions, or insights, because, oh my God, it's impossible to decipher, feel free to send those my way as well. And then I can include those in those episodes, or in that episode, I should say. So thanks again so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a safe, happy, healthy, fun rest of your week. I will see you next time.